everybody. Welcome to the CNS Summit panel, Expanded Access, Saving Lives and Generating Real-World Evidence. My name is Mika Newton. I'm going to introduce myself, and then I'm going to have the rest of the panel here introduce themselves, and then we'll get into our discussion today. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of a company called xCures. At xCures, we've built a platform to connect advanced cancer patients to the treatments and tests they need. In the process, we're able to prospectively collect real-world evidence directly from their providers, enabling its use both in development and commercialization. Prior to xCures, I spent the last 20 years really focused on the intersection of evidence, data, and computer science, both in early stage discovery, development, and commercialization of novel therapeutics. I'd now like to turn it over to the panel to introduce themselves. Dr. Aliu, could you introduce yourself to start, please?
Thanks, Mika. Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Aliu. I head the Global Governance Office within the Cross-Divisional Chief Medical Office of Novartis. And as a part of my role, I'm responsible and have oversight for the establishment of standards, training, systems for all peri and post-registration medical programs, and that includes expanded access and compassionate use.
Thank you, Paul. Dr. Grandis?
Hello, everybody. My name is Jennifer Grandis. I'm a physician scientist, specifically an otolaryngologist, head and neck surgeon. In my institutional roles, now at the University of California at San Francisco, I have overseen all clinical and translational research. In my own personal life, it's been focused on head and neck cancer.
Thank you, Dr. Grandis. Dr. Lacayo.
Good morning. My name is Norman Lacayo. I'm a pediatric oncologist at Stanford University. And I'm also the director of the Pediatric Oncology Experimental Therapeutics Investigators Consortium of 10 centers, 1 in Canada and 9 in the US. And I focus on early clinical trials in the area of leukemia. But now in my role of Poetic, we've expanded and we're trying to leverage all our colleagues in pediatric oncology from different areas of needs to support our consortium to really move forward drug development and to seek innovative solutions for drug development in children.
Thank you. And Dr. Monje?
I'm a pediatric neuro-oncologist and a basic and translational researcher focused on translating novel therapeutics for childhood brain cancers to the clinic and to early phase clinical trial. In that role, I also co-lead Stanford's involvement in the Pediatric Brain Tumor Consortium.
Well, thank you all very much. As I was telling some of you earlier, we were getting started. I'm often not nervous around these situations, but with such an esteemed panel, I had to wake up this morning and make sure I was trying to put my best face on. So let's start with some questions. Maybe Dr. Aliu, could you explain to us a little bit about managed access programs and expanded access programs?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just to give a global context, because depending on where you are, it's important to highlight these programs have different names and nomenclatures, but they mean pretty much the same thing. So if you're in the US, it's expanded access. If you're in Europe, it's compassionate use. Depending on where you are, it's called managed access, special access schemes, but pretty much they mean the same thing. And from a definition perspective, it's the provision of an investigational or unapproved product to a patient. And that's a patient outside of the context of a clinical trial for a serious or life-threatening condition where there are no alternative or comparable treatment options for the patient. And in every country where this is done, it's subject to local rules and regulations. So the criteria are fairly similar. There's some different local nuances depending on which country you're dealing with, but by and large, it's really to address an unmet need in patients that have no options.
Well, it's a very interesting area, one that we've certainly seen a lot of interest, and I've been following the US as much with the FDA and Project Facilitate and quite a number of initiatives now in this space. Maybe to go to the other side of our topic for today, Dr. Grandis, could you talk to us a little bit about real-world data and evidence and its strengths and weaknesses from a research perspective, how you think about our RWDE as a researcher?
Well, at the end of the day, Mika, it's actually all that matters. Those of us who live and work in an academic environment recognize the importance of designing our clinical trials, particularly when we get into the phase 3 setting where we're comparing new treatments to standard of care. But quite frankly, nothing works perfectly in the real world. We can't control for all of the variables that we bake into our trials in order to be able to make determinations about initially toxicity and ultimately efficacy. And it's really how the drugs work in the real world with patients who may or may not be able to filter out those inclusion and exclusion criteria that we use for our clinical trials that ultimately matters. In fact, what I've learned over the course of my career is that the enthusiasm that we feel at the time of FDA approval of a drug should be muted, because it really ultimately matters how that drug is used in the real world by patients, by their families, and the ultimate efficacy is not the results in our clinical trials. It's really how those drugs work in the real world.
Dr. Lacayo, how do you use expanded access specifically as a mechanism in the context of patient care in pediatric oncology? This is something we were discussing just in a personal, and can you give us maybe some specific examples of the types of cases where you think expanded access programs are particularly important?
Yes, so in the area of pediatrics, we're very successful in curing a large percentage of patients. So we really have a small number of patients available for early phase trials. So the dilemma there is that as clinical trialists, our obligation is to attempt to enroll, if possible, any and all patients into a clinical trial. But again, when you're faced with a real world environment, not all patients are eligible for trials. So that's where this whole world of compassionate use, expanded access, allows us to, again, follow a patient-centric, play a patient-centric role here and use these mechanisms to help patients in need. And again, for those of us who are at academic centers, really the push is to really try to enroll patients in trials or the nearest center that has a trial available for the patient. But again, going back to the real world environment, this imposes significant psychosocial, economic stresses on families. So in a way, we are at times forced to try to use this mechanism to help patients. What's lacking in pediatric oncology so far is the ability to really be able to, as you know, we've had many discussions with xCures, that we need to learn from all children all the time, everywhere. And there's an area that really there's no coordinated effort in figuring out how we can develop a novel way of capturing that information, that real world information, one, to serve the patients, which is why, we are physicians and why we practice at academic centers. But more importantly, we have to figure a way of capturing, when we make use of compassionate use of expanded access, really capture that information to better inform new clinical trials. And we're now in an environment of a month since the RACE Act for Children has become law. And I'm very concerned that we'll have so many companies with so many drugs coming to pediatric oncologists in all subspecialties to seek, figure out a way of studying their drug. Whereas we're faced with unique patients in the era of, deep sequencing. We can identify targets in many patients. So we keep really slicing, making smaller all these group of patients. So we have to figure out a way, again, of taking these rare patients, the diversity of patients, and match them with a drug for specific target or targets that may be present in their cancer. So it's a big challenge for us. And the current model of phase 1, 1B, phase 2 studies won't suffice for pediatric oncology and in the United States and everywhere else in the world. So we don't, so long-winded answer to tell you, we don't use it very often, but I think we're getting to the point because of the depth of knowledge of the patient's unique tumor that we are really forced to seek if we get a biology signal from the patient's cancer, we try to match it to a drug and a target. And that's becoming increasingly difficult with, again, the way we study and develop drugs.
Thank you for that, Dr. Lacayo. You know, I was looking, Dr. Monje, at your background as we were coming into this, this program, and I realized that you've done a lot of work in DIPG. It's actually a very rare cancer I'm somewhat familiar with, not as obviously as an oncologist, but from programs that we've been working on as a company. And one of my first experiences when I started at xCures was actually talking with and seeing some of the families who were struggling with this really devastating condition. So maybe for all of us in the audience, can you tell us maybe a little bit about what DIPG is, just for those who may not be fully aware of the disease? And then tell us a little bit about your work and how you integrate both care and research, particularly now where we're talking about quite a rare condition.
Sure, absolutely. So DIPG, which stands for diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, is it's really just a horrific disease. It occurs typically in children, although it does sometimes occur in adults, and typically around the age of 6 to 7, although it can happen certainly in younger and in older patients. It emerges in the brainstem, which of course is a critical structure to have a cancer in. And it progresses once it is clinically evident quite rapidly. The median survival is only 9 months. Until very recently, we knew almost nothing about DIPG because it can't be surgically resected. It's a disease that, intimately integrates into these critical neural circuits. There's no way to cut it out. And so there was very little tissue available for research. And actually through pretty astoundingly selfless acts by families, donating their children's brains in the early period after death, we began to be able to, culture the tumor, to make experimental model systems in the lab, to begin to study it. And that effort began in my lab and others about 12 years ago now. And in the last decade, we've learned so much about this disease. And I think we're now in this kind of really exciting phase of beginning to leverage that understanding in biology to offer, novel therapeutic options in early phase clinical trials. But the challenge is, for this relatively rare disease that strikes 200 to 400 children in the U.S. each year, it's also one of the more common diseases that we see in pediatric oncology. It's the leading cause of brain tumor-related death. And so, it's common and also not horribly not common. And we just don't have enough options. The only thing that has extended survival in DIPG, consistently to date has been radiation. And that just took median survival from 6 months to 3 months. So we have so far to go to offer effective therapies for these children. And, in my laboratory, we focus on, leveraging these patient-derived resources to do single agent and combinatorial drug screening. We've sought immunotherapeutic targets, and we've tried to understand the fundamental biology of where these tumors kind of emerge from in the course of development and what really drives their progression. And we've discovered these really fascinating and potentially therapeutically targetable interactions of the tumor cells with normal neural circuits and normal neurons. And so there are now early phase clinical trials in all 3 of these areas, the cell intrinsic vulnerabilities of the tumor. And there's some exciting immunotherapeutic early phase trials, as well as these trials focusing on targeting the neuroscience of this brain cancer. But they're early, and there are very few spots on each of these trials. And so, that gets into the challenge and really the critical importance of expanded access, particularly if and when there is a therapeutic signal that's gleaned from these early phase trials.
Thank you, Dr. Monje. You bring up a really great point that we've noticed, which is a lot of patients, when you think from the patient perspective, see research from a very different perspective that researchers see research. And so I know, Dr. Grandis, you've been involved in a lot of different research programs. Could you comment a little bit about what you see as you interpret the patient's reasons for participating, kind of what motivates patients to get involved in research? Like what's driving them from their own personal level?
That's an incredibly important question, Mika, and I suspect there's some cultural differences worldwide. But in general, I think we have a long way to go to engage patients as partners in discovery. I think for too long, and I would say we also in academia need to engage our colleagues in the community, because the vast majority, at least of adult cancer patients, are cared for by community oncologists. They don't make it to Stanford or UCSF or other academic centers. In my experience, I think patients and their families do this for two reasons. Number one is hope. They believe that by participating, they will derive some benefit. And this is even in the face of phase 1 trials where we explicitly let them know that the expectation for clinical benefit is not the priority of the trial. It's really a safety signal, but everybody has hope and everybody has the right to have hope. And I think we need to balance our regulatory requirements to be to not raise unrealistic expectations and allow the patient and their family to have hope. But from my point of view, another really incredibly important and often unrecognized motivation is altruism. I have been so impressed by individuals, and again, I'm mostly talking about adult oncology patients who are motivated to do something for themselves that probably won't help them, but will help others. And I'd like to amplify what Dr. Monje just alluded to, which I think is so important. The idea that we have gotten so far away from autopsies, from harvesting really incredibly important and valuable tissue resources to drive discovery. It's more than a shame. I mean, it really is a travesty. And because we are stuck in the who pays for this, who has this conversation, how do we bring up the specter of death in the context of a clinical relationship, we often don't do this, and we leave it up to brave people like Dr. Monje and other oncologists to actually have this conversation. But I don't know a single cancer patient or their family who doesn't want to be on the team. They want to partner with us. They want to help us. They want to help themselves, and they want to help others. And I think the sooner we have these conversations in the relationship, the better.
So I guess switching maybe a little bit, Dr. Aliu, to the other perspective, or a different perspective from a global pharmaceutical company like Novartis's perspective, how do you think about your strategy related to managed access? You know, you're in the business of developing and bringing to market life-saving medicines. Where does managed access and expanded access fit into those programs? How do you perceive them?
No, thanks, Mika. I think it's important to highlight that for us, expanded access or managed access has moved from being a side activity to actually being integrated into our clinical research programs. So it's always worth highlighting that we actually have every program or every development program think about a managed access strategy within the clinical development program. And I think, you know, that goes back to a lot of our history in oncology when you think about 20 years ago with imatinib in our case, where you know, we had a clinical development program, phase 2, 1,000 patients in 6 countries, but we had an expanded access in 34 countries with almost 8,000 patients. So I think, you know, similar to what Dr. Grandis has said, and I think Dr. Monje has also said before, we realized that a lot more patients are able to access the drug via these expanded access or compassionate use programs, because we can't put every patient in a trial. Not every patient is able to reach an academic center. Not every patient is actually seen in an academic center, just for different reasons. So for us, when we look strategically about our managed access program, we also look at the available data. What's the data coming through on that particular drug? What's the evidence that we can see? How early can we start a program? I have to say we probably have been a bit more risk tolerant than most, again, because of the diversity of our portfolio. So some of the things we also are beginning to look at right now, especially in the oncology space with the targeted therapies. You know, now there's a lot of gene sequencing. We know these drugs are targeting specific mutations. So while we may be focused on developing those drugs in particular indications, when we then look at the expanded access or compassionate use programs, as a company, we're actually open to looking at requests for patients where we do have that gene sequencing information and where there is some evidence that this patient may benefit. from using that treatment. So these are all some of the different things that we look at strategically. Of course, being a large multinational, we also look at scope. I mean, our default is always to run a global program. We try as much as possible to make the program global, but then it's also this case of how quickly can you scale that up to a global program? Does it need to start locally, go regionally before you then kind of, go globally? So there's so many factors that we take into consideration, but ultimately, I think one of the things that resonates with us and also with a lot of treating physicians that we work with, it's really focused on how can we get that drug that's addressing an unmet need to get to a patient that needs it, who cannot get into a trial.
It's really helpful. How do you, just a kind of follow-on question from my part, how do you deal with the complexity of the local regulatory landscape? I mean, it just feels to me like it must be a challenge when most countries have how do we say, the same program by a different name. Are they really the same, or do you need to think about them differently on a global basis?
I mean, that's a great question, because this has been one of the challenges of doing a program on a truly global scale. I do have to say the global regulation in this space has evolved over time. I mean, 20 years ago when we were doing this, it was a lot more of a challenge. In fact, some countries had absolutely no regulations for this. The only way in many countries a patient could get access was through a clinical trial. So you can imagine the limitation of the scope. So the US in particular, France, a few of the other countries have been trailblazing, I have to say, the regulators, in actually ensuring that there is a pathway, for this kind of patient, for patients to access drug via expanded or compassionate use means. But for us as a company, one of the things we've also done with our program, we've looked extensively at regulations of over 100 countries. So our policy for managed access has actually been designed based on, the regulations of all of these countries, where we've looked at what are the commonalities from these different countries, what are the different variations. So we develop our program taking into consideration all of the local nuances. So, we do have a global program, but the program also allows for certain local nuances, and that just makes it more efficient from our perspective. And I mean, I can say we right now provide managed access or expanded access, whichever way you call it, to over 100 countries, kind of looking on an annual basis. So we do get requests from physicians from over 100 countries. So, I mean, based on what we see so far, it's constantly evolving. I mean, one of the other areas also where we've taken on a role within what we call our Managed Access Center of Excellence is actually to work with regulators in some countries, especially in the developing countries and some of the kind of emerging countries, in how they shape some of that regulation. So, having that experience of dealing with so many different regulations, we're also able to have a dialogue and, kind of advise on where we see best practice, where there's room for improvement, and pretty much anything that can help patients from that particular country to get access.
So I'm sorry to keep picking on you here, but I just have one more question as I was thinking as you were talking, which is really, how do you see your colleagues in the other large global companies? Is there a thought that you see? Obviously, I understand you can't speak on their behalfs, but just kind of thinking about your colleagues and maybe some of the other larger organizations, do you see this as a global cross-industry trend, or is it still kind of emergent? What's your sense of where we are in the development?
I think it's emerging. I mean, let's put it that way. And again, not to speak for my other industry partners, but I think it's also important to highlight that, especially in this space, the industry is really talking and collaborating. There are so many forums and so many platforms where we share best practices, where we talk about what's working, because ultimately, I think across all of the companies, there is a shared common goal to provide access for patients. The question is usually how to do it, what's possible, where, in which countries, and how best to do it. So we are sharing a lot of best practice, and I think a lot of things are changing. You mentioned earlier on the FDA Project Facilitate. I think the FDA in itself has evolved its regulations quite a lot in this space over the last couple of years. They're not alone in that. A lot of other regulators are also doing similar things. A lot of companies are doing similar things. The 21st Century Cures Act, for example, was a big one, where when you think about it, a lot of companies did not even have a public policy for expanded access prior to the 21st Century Cures Act. And right now, I think for the big companies, that number went from about 50% to about 84%. They actually have a publicly available position and are clear on how a patient or a physician can actually request a drug from the company. Then you look also at the final rule. Right now, all expanded access programs are entered into clinicaltrials.gov. Then the FDA Navigator with the Reagan-Udall Foundation also lists all available compounds and programs, into their Navigator tool. So I think in terms of transparency and what's available, we've really moved a long way in the last 10 years. But the reality is, I think there's still a long way to go.
Thank you. So switching back, Dr. Monje, to kind of the patient perspective, as patients look at this, and you think in particular of these patients who are coming into your lab and coming onto your research programs, what are the barriers? Like, what do you see? What happens when patients are not able to participate? Like, what drives that? Are there some common themes among the patients that really just kind of raise a red flag for you, maybe even early in your interactions with them, that this is going to be particularly difficult?
I think that, when patients successfully get themselves to us at Stanford, we are usually able to successfully offer them clinical trial options. The problem is the great number of patients who, for many different reasons, can't access an academic center like Stanford. I mean, thinking about parents with relatively young children, the commitment to move to a new place. And in the West, there's a wide geographic catchment area. People have to come from other states or from hundreds and hundreds of miles away, even within the same state. Thinking about, the issues of siblings having to leave other siblings at home, their school issues, the cost of coming, even with support, it's really challenging. And I think that, the people with the most resources are able to accomplish this. And I worry very much about not being able to offer access to people with fewer resources to navigate their way to an academic center.
Yeah, I think you touched on a subject we've at least internally been talking a lot about, which is just the disparity in socio-geographically across even a country like the United States, right? It's just immense. And when I start thinking of that on the global basis, just availability and all the rest of it, this is not a simple problem, and there's probably not a simple solution. It's just really encouraging to see us moving forward. So Dr. Lacayo, you've told me in our own discussions with each other about a number of specific examples where kind of real world evidence on the combination use of particular off-label and new investigational therapies would be valuable, is valuable, or would have enabled us to move quicker. Maybe this is a little bit of a retrospective look. Could you maybe share your thoughts and maybe some of those specific examples with us?
Thank you for the question, Mika. So I'll just mention two examples. It's all public data. So there's one particular drug called azacitidine that's been around for several decades and really not approved in pediatrics. But there's been so many children treated with this drug in the setting of acute myeloid leukemia or myelodysplastic syndrome that had we had the mechanism to gather the information on all these patients over the last decade, we probably would have enough real world data that you could probably make compliant for approval of this drug. We currently partner, and this is funded by the St. Jude Consortium, a study in AML where we use priming with this drug azacitidine before conventional chemotherapy in AML. And it's very puzzling. Drug's been around for a long time, not approved in children, but it's a drug that, as we meet in different either tumor boards, a discussion with colleagues around the country and even international, is a drug that's very frequently used. There's only been one early phase study with azacitidine in AML with very few patients, but it is just puzzling how we all are using this drug, but it's not approved for children. And again, Now we have a study, a frontline study. It was a phase 1, phase 2 study in AML that we're using, and we hope that in a couple of years we'll have enough information that might help for this drug to be approved. The second example, again, all public information, is that it's a BCL2 inhibitor, venetoclax, where there are a couple of studies. I think the companies that are developing these drugs are forward-looking. But again, it's been approved for adult indications, and many pediatric oncologists use this agent and off-label use for children. And, it is easier to do the off-label use than go through the process of compassionate use. And, all our academic centers are, in spite of the resources, it's very challenging to try to, again, follow up on having staff that can contact a company and get compassionate access to the drug. So that's one example where we've really used we use off-label use of the drug. And I can't give you numbers, but just in as frequently I talk with people around the country and outside of the country, I wouldn't be surprised if there are more children have been treated with this drug than have been treated on the current clinical trials. And again, a lost opportunity of using this real world data, again, to help us move drug development at a faster pace. And then I'm not even talking about combinations. Once you have the issue of combination therapies, again, it's all held back because of the lack of harnessing this real world data that would help us move things much faster for our patients.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lacayo. So I have a question, kind of last question here, maybe for all of us. I think I'll just go in order. Jenny, I see you. I'm going to go ahead. I think you have a follow-on comment to make. Go ahead.
Well, one of the things that I've been really thinking about a lot, I've been serving as a consultant for the NIH for the past 6 months. And as everybody probably knows, although I'm surprised how many people don't know, the NIH is the largest research hospital in the world. So the clinical center at the NIH is an extraordinary facility. And every patient who comes to the clinical center is on a protocol. And half of those protocols are called natural history protocols. And we haven't thought much about that in the extramural world. And one of the ways to sort of link all these concepts together is to socialize the concept of every patient with a disease, in this case, we're talking about cancer, being enrolled on something that we'll call a natural history protocol. And the obstacles are mostly psychological, which we can overcome, but there are also some real resource issues. What we have to recognize is that in the context of a busy clinical practice, there aren't people there who are necessarily trained or empowered to collect and enter data. But the value of this data is so extraordinary that I can't imagine that we can't find a way, just as the pharmaceutical industry has done, to come together and to really recognize the importance of real world data. And if we took the lead in academia, partnered, in the NCI cooperative group mechanism, we all partner with community oncologists. That's a really wonderful playground that we all agreed to share. It seems to me that if the natural history protocols could exist in the outside world, in the real world, and we could collect this data in real time, we could go so much more quickly. And the cost, if you will, of doing it is relatively modest, but it's not zero. And we need to recognize that.
It's a wonderful point. That actually teed up my last question perfectly, Dr. Grandis. So thank you. At xCures, in partnership with a bunch of our advocacy partners, what we've been looking at is how do we not only enable patients and their oncologists to find and get access to particular treatment options, but how do we learn from that? And what are the mechanisms to learn from that? And we've been working on kind of developing a pretty standard set of centralized methods. We think there's enormous opportunity here. We're early still and beginning to develop what we're doing. But just from your perspective, and maybe I'll start with Dr. Aliu, if we were able to actually capture all of this information from all of the, let's call them programs outside of clinical trials, because I know we're using a lot of different words for them, how could that help, maybe from your perspective and perhaps Novartis's as well?
No, thanks. Absolutely. I mean, it's going to be extremely helpful. I think experience has shown us that these data, they not only tell us a lot more about what's happening in that patient population, but actually they're very complementary to what we get from the clinical trials. Again, we have quite a lot of case examples in-house from my expanded access programs where we have collected data, and that data has actually shown how the drugs pretty much behaved in a broader population, an expanded population of patients beyond that trial population. And some of these, depending on the country, some of that information has been useful for regulators, as well as even for payers who want to actually better understand. And I think more importantly, for clinicians who are going to treat these patients. So we, as a policy, are actually collecting real-world data from all our expanded access programs. So I think from a personal and even from an organizational perspective, it's absolutely vital, because moving forward, every data is important data. And more so when you start to look at rare disease populations, when we start to look at pediatric populations, any information becomes very, very useful in informing us as a healthcare community about how to better use that drug and the value of that drug in the patient population.
Wonderful, thank you. Maybe Dr. Lacayo, any further comment on kind of positive, negative opportunities here?
Actually, I have a question for Dr. Aliu. So one big problem with the real world data is lack of resources.
Yeah.
Right? If I offer this to a patient at my center, I don't have the resources really to collect that data. So the question is, what's the environment in pharma? Do you think pharma would fund some of this, reimburse some costs for collecting whatever data, would be best and from the perspective of the pharma companies?
No, thanks, Dr. Lacayo, for that question. Those are areas we're looking at, and you're right. I think, again, as an organization, there is value in collecting that data. And I feel one of our roles is to enable the collection of that data. And that comes in different formats, which could include funding, as you rightly said. I think one of the other things we've learned is also to keep things streamlined and keep it simple. Because one of the things, especially for a global company, which we realize having to deal with different treatment centers, different countries, different regulations, is depending on the data collection, certain things are not allowed in some countries, certain things, some countries can collect a bit more than others. And that's the first thing. Also, when you want to collect data in centers which are not academic centers, these are treating physicians who are not used to doing clinical research. They don't have a trial nurse. They don't have a trial coordinator, especially in a lot of like the community or general hospitals. So there's quite a lot of these type of centers or clinics that are involved in expanded access. And so one of the areas we're also looking at is using technology. How do we leverage technology to be able to collect such data? And so those are a lot of things that we are currently exploring. And I know a lot of other pharma companies are exploring at the moment. So we've actually built the data collection module into our electronic system. So the same system where you as a treating physician will request the drug from, if you need a resupply, you request from that system. That's also the same system where you can actually use, where we use to collect data on the patients on a periodic basis, so that everything's all in the same place. I mean, we're exploring quite a few pilots at the moment. So it's be interesting maybe in a year's time what, we would have more information, and I should be able to speak more about our experience on data collection and all the different pilots we're running in-house.
Dr. Monje, do you have some thoughts on positive, negative viewpoints, perhaps on integrating real world evidence? How do you see it in the context of the research you've been?
I think real world evidence is enormously helpful. And I think, as Dr. Grandis has said, it's what this is all about. If the therapies that we're trying to advance are actually helping people in the real world. I know that there are many therapies presently still in early phase clinical trial that children with pediatric brain tumors often receive on a compassionate use basis for many different logistical reasons, and we're not capturing that. We don't know. We can't include, certainly can't include that information relevant to the clinical trial. But if we want to just take a broad view and say, did kids who get drug X do better. We don't really have a great way to do that in a broad way, and that's a real opportunity lost. Or, you know, perhaps if we discover something in the laboratory and we want to know if children who might have received that agent, perhaps it's an agent used for other reasons, did better or worse, that data is often not available outside of our own hospital system. And so, you know, having a broader way to ask those questions and capture that data, I think would really advance the clinical science.
Thank you. And I'm going to, I guess, Dr. Grandis, you kind of led off with the pre-question. I want to see if you had any other comments, and then I was going to open it up for maybe any last general discussion points.
The only thing I would say is that the cost is real, but it's not insurmountable. And what I'm wondering is if there's real examples of partnership. What I've been extraordinarily impressed by in my roles at UCSF and nationally is the real value of clinical data. And value, I don't mean monetary value, but scientific value. And I think that, you know, at the University of California, for example, we have aggregated all of our clinical data warehouses, which is an extraordinarily large number of patients. And we're finding that many pharmaceutical companies, for example, are very interested in understanding how their drugs are working in patients who are getting those drugs. And if we just figured out a way to create these extramural platforms that were protected, privacy, secure, I think the return on investment is extraordinary. The costs are real, but I think the larger issue is a social one.
You bring up a great point, actually. I think the costs are probably less than one would expect, but certainly not insignificant, right? They're somewhere in the middle of this process. And what's been, I think, very interesting over the last 2 years working in this intersection is actually how much the patients also want this data, particularly those patients who have a dire diagnosis, who are really looking at trying to understand what should I be thinking about doing. And if you, and I've been through this in my own life a few times, when you're dealing with a disease like this and you start thinking about what should I do, right? What are my real opportunities and options? And you realize that they probably realistically fall on the border of research and or some sort of alternative therapy, because we can look at the great data we have on standard of care and realize that it's not the answer. It may have certain advantages depending on personal preference. Maybe it's around achieving some certain survival or certain safety tolerability. You know, everybody's individual. But for people who are just trying to say, what is it that could help me beat this, right? You're looking at thousands of possibilities and combinations and intersections. And so, as I said, I think we're kind of early in this discussion. It's very encouraging from my perspective to hear all of your perspectives and the fact that we're going in this direction, because I think this understanding is something that, frankly, we'll all need, whether for ourselves or our family members or as a society in whole. So I want to see if there's any last comments or any additional questions, and other, please, if you'd like to raise your hand, then I'll. No, oh, wonderful. Well, I want to thank you all so much. As I said, it's truly an honor to be able to have this time with you all. I really appreciate it. Thank you to CNS Summit for putting this together and giving us an opportunity to talk about this topic. And I'm sure as the summit progresses, if there are any other questions, we'll come back out to the group. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well.